Have you noticed how the narrative that sunscreen is bad for you has grown? People saying they don't use it anymore, that daily sunscreen use is an exaggeration, that it interferes with vitamin D, or that there are risks from sunscreen that no one talks about. This anti-sunscreen movement has been gaining traction in Brazil, especially on social media, and the worst part is that many people are changing their habits based on this. But here's the problem: they mix truths, half-truths, and myths, all in the same package. And when it comes to health, skin, and sun exposure, making decisions without understanding what the science really shows can be costly in the long run. The question isn't whether questioning is wrong, the question is who is right in this debate. In this video, I'm going to analyze the controversy over sunscreen use based on scientific data, recent research, and medical consensus. We'll talk about whether sunscreen is really necessary, the relationship between sunscreen and vitamin D, the differences between chemical and physical sunscreens, whether natural sunscreen works, and why this debate has gained so much traction in Brazil. By the end, you'll be able to separate myth from evidence and make a much more informed decision. And the first point, which almost no one explains properly, starts now. Before getting into the controversy, we need to look at the numbers. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer in the world, with millions of new cases diagnosed every year. Global estimates show that more than 1 in every 3 cancers diagnosed is skin cancer, and the main cause is linked to ultraviolet radiation. This isn't an isolated issue, it's a global public health problem. That's because solar radiation acts cumulatively. In other words, it's not just the sunburn from a beach vacation that counts, but the sum of small exposures over a lifetime. This radiation damages the DNA of skin cells, accelerates photoaging, increases spots, sagging, and alters the collagen structure. And over time, this accumulated damage significantly increases the risk of skin cancer. Population studies show that people with more unprotected sun exposure over their lifetime have higher rates of premalignant and malignant skin lesions. That's why sunscreen use has never been advocated for just for aesthetics, but as a risk reduction strategy. This is the background that often gets lost when the discussion becomes just about opinion or ideology. Now that this context is clear, it's understandable why the debate over sunscreen is so sensitive. Where did the movement against sunscreen come from? The questioning of sunscreen use didn't come out of nowhere. It starts with a legitimate feeling. Many people became suspicious of everything chemical and industrialized. Daily use products, long labels, difficult names, and narratives of continuous use created the idea that something so common could hide risks. From this, influencers emerged advocating for sun exposure without sunscreen, associating the product with diseases or hormonal problems. The problem is that this debate originated more on social media than within science. Another important point was the comparison with other movements of medical distrust, similar to what happened with vaccines, medications, and even medical tests. A narrative of hidden truths and corrupted science was created. Strong phrases like sunscreen causes cancer or sunscreen is bad for your health grab attention, generate clicks, and go viral quickly. But they are almost never accompanied by context, complete data, or a critical analysis of scientific research. And fear spreads faster than the explanation. When we look at scientific data, the scenario is quite different from the alarmist discourse. The main medical and dermatological societies continue to recommend using sunscreen based on extensive population studies. These studies show a consistent reduction in damage caused by ultraviolet radiation over time. This does not mean that sunscreen is perfect or exempt from debate, but it does mean that science does not support the idea that it is a hidden villain. And it is exactly this difference between scientific criticism and misinformation that we need to understand before we move on. Does sunscreen block vitamin D? One of the most common arguments from those who question its daily use is the idea that sunscreen prevents vitamin D production. And this doubt didn't just come out of nowhere. Vitamin D really does depend on exposure to UVB radiation to be produced in the skin. And from that comes a simplistic line of reasoning. If sunscreen blocks the sun, it would also block vitamin D. The problem is that the human body doesn't work in such a binary way, and that's where a lot of correct information starts to be used incorrectly. In practice, studies show that the real-world use of sunscreen on a daily basis does not completely stop vitamin D production. That's because people don't apply the ideal amount of sunscreen, don't reapply it as often as they should, and don't cover 100% of their skin all the time. In addition, small incidental sun exposures like walking down the street, driving, and daily activities are already enough to stimulate production in many cases. So much so that populations that use sunscreen regularly do not generally show higher rates of deficiency for that reason alone. When a deficiency does exist, it's usually linked to other factors. Another point that is not often discussed is that vitamin D should not be obtained at the cost of cumulative skin damage. Today, science understands that, if necessary, replenishment can be done safely through diet or supplementation. However, the damage caused by ultraviolet radiation is cumulative, irreversible, and there is no supplement that can reverse it. This imbalance between risk and benefit almost never appears in videos that advocate for abandoning sunscreen. And this sets the stage for the next point. Does sunscreen cause cancer? The phrase sunscreen causes cancer is one of the strongest, and also one of the most distorted in this debate. It usually stems from a superficial reading of laboratory or environmental studies, without clinical context. Some research has evaluated isolated cellular effects or the environmental impacts of certain filters, especially in marine organisms. This data, which has specific scientific value, was extrapolated to draw conclusions about the risk to humans, and that's how a technical hypothesis turned into popular fear. When we look at long-term population studies, the picture is completely different. Studies that have followed large groups over the years show that regular sunscreen use is associated with a reduced risk of skin cancer. This is because there is no robust evidence showing an increase in cancer among sunscreen users. On the contrary, the data points in the opposite direction, and this discrepancy rarely appears in viral content. The problem is that the human brain reacts more to fear than to statistics. That's because an alarming phrase gets more clicks than a well-explained chart. And when fear spreads without a scientific counterpoint, many people start avoiding sunscreen, believing they are protecting themselves. This reverse effect is one of the biggest risks of this type of misinformation, and this leads us to the real impact of radiation over time. Sunscreen in everyday life. What changes when you're not at the beach? When we talk about daily sunscreen use, many people only think of the beach, the pool, or strong sun, but most sun exposure happens discreetly in everyday life, while driving, walking down the street, and sitting near windows. UVB radiation is more intense, is linked to sunburns, and varies depending on the time of day and the season. UVA, on the other hand, is more constant, penetrates deeper into the skin, and passes through clouds in regular glass. And it's precisely this radiation that contributes most to cumulative damage, photoaging, and cellular changes over time. While UVB gets attention because it burns, UVA acts silently. It doesn't usually cause immediate pain, but it alters collagen and elastin fibers and the DNA of skin cells. That's why even on cloudy days or inside a car, the skin continues to receive this type of radiation. This is a point that is often ignored when the topic is just about leisure or vacation. Chronic exposure added up over a lifetime is what really takes a toll. Therefore, the debate about sunscreen is not limited to leisure, but to daily routine. It's not about living in fear of the sun, but about understanding how and when the radiation acts. Prevention ceases to be a one-time act and becomes a long-term strategy. And this detail completely changes the way we see the use of sunscreen and prepares the ground for a more conscious decision. Before we continue, let me ask you a favor. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot to continue making content here for YouTube and to grow the Medico Sangeleco channel. Does natural sunscreen work, or is it more marketing than protection? With the growth of the anti-sunscreen movement, the search for natural alternatives also emerged. Vegetable oils, butters, homemade recipes, and cosmetics labeled as natural began to be promoted as substitutes for sunscreen. The promise is seductive, chemical-free protection without risks and in harmony with your body. The problem is that sun protection doesn't work by intention, but by a proven ability to block radiation. And this is where science needs to enter the conversation. When these products are evaluated in a laboratory, most of them show an extremely low or inconsistent protection factor. Some oils even absorb part of the UVB radiation, but they offer almost no protection against UVA. Furthermore, the amount needed to achieve any protective effect would be impractical for real-world use. In practice, the person believes they are protected, but they continue to receive a significant amount of radiation. This false sense of security is one of the biggest risks. Another point that is rarely discussed is that the term natural is not synonymous with safe and effective. Many natural ingredients have not undergone standardized tests for photoprotection, stability, and long-term safety. On the other hand, regulated sunscreens must prove their protection factor, their spectrum of action, and their stability in the sun. And this doesn't mean demonizing what's natural, but understanding the different limits and functions. And it is exactly this confusion that fuels a large part of the controversy. Why did Brazil become fertile ground for this controversy? Brazil brings together factors that favor this type of debate. We are a tropical country with high sun exposure and a culture strongly linked to the body, aesthetics, and the sun. At the same time, the discourse of a natural life and distrust of industrialized products has grown. This makes it more intuitive to question the daily use of sunscreen. Social media amplifies this scenario. Strong phrases and personal experiences go viral more than scientific explanations. This is because often the algorithm rewards emotion and not context. Thus, individual opinions end up seeming more convincing than population data. In the midst of so much controversy, quality information makes all the difference. Understanding what science shows helps you make decisions without fear and without exaggeration. If you've made it this far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot and strengthens this type of content. I'll leave an Amazon link in the description with the sunscreen I usually use for anyone who wants to check it out. See you next time.